We're in Brooklyn Heights today. My name's Nick Potts. I'm an architect, and we're going to be giving you an architectural walking tour of the neighborhood. Brooklyn Heights was really the first suburb, and obviously before there was a train, there was a ferry at the top of this street. And so a lot of people who worked in the Wall Street downtown area, which was really where New York was, this was kind of the residential community for that. So these would have been kind of up-and-coming, upper middle class people. We are on Willow Street today looking at a grouping of late federal townhouses. Most of the houses built around this time were painted weirdly, even though they were brick. Even in some of the earlier buildings, they would actually paint out the mortar between the bricks and actually paint that in a different color. These are all a bit more monochrome, almost painted to look like they were brick. The square carving on top of that, there's a little bit of style being brought in at this point. This is right, when the nation was new, we were looking for our own forms, and people were looking towards Greece because it was an ideal of democracy. And so you see that these kind of Greek key motifs and rectangles, these kind of geometric decorative elements started being applied to the materials. There's some ionic columns built into the door enfrayments and leaded glass, which is drawing a bit from what you find in stained glass, where there's an H-shaped piece of lead the glass threads into. It's a way of dealing with very small pieces of material and creating something beautiful out of it. This house behind me, the blue-gray one, this is actually a very early house. You can tell because it's a wood frame. In New York City, building codes started changing to the point where by the 1830s, new building codes were enacted that essentially outlawed the construction of new wood buildings within the confines of the city. It was because of fire. There are a few really big fires more in Manhattan that made them enact these building codes to kind of protect the safety of the city. So you can see this federal style wood frame house is kind of a rare survivor of kind of pre-brick period. This is a very typical federal style entry. The federal style houses were fairly simple, and the door enfrainment was where the builders were much more exuberant. And you see the leaded glass fan light, the arch, there's a little bit of shelter. Stoops are a really interesting New York solution to the fact that we don't have alleys. Every house needs a way of getting goods and services. You can have essentially a door tuck underneath the main entrance. So the building behind me right now is a Queen Anne style townhouse from sometime between the 1870s and the 1880s. I can tell because of both the shape of the building and the different types of materials that are used. They're almost always asymmetrical. There's a really kind of crazy attic story where they really were going to town with trying to create something new and different. I really can't imagine what its inspiration was, and it seems almost medieval, and it's possible that they were looking towards things like castles, but it's totally unlike anything you've ever seen. The most notable thing would be the terracotta ornament on top of the windows and his inset spandrel panels across the building. Terracotta is a material it's essentially built like a brick. It's a clay that's fired, but terracotta is poured into a mold, so you can get these really kind of deep relief sculpted shapes out of it. So behind me are two Gothic Revival townhouses built in the 1840s. Two things that are really interesting about these Gothic Revival townhouses are the pointed arch over the doors, which is a motif that was inspired by churches and 12th century medieval architecture. The other interesting thing about these townhouses is the detail on top of the windows, which is called a hooded lintel. Again, taking a very simple kind of horizontal lintel and doing something new and fresh with it that really has no function aside from purely decorative. So here we are on Pierpont Street, another example of a Gothic Revival house. This one is more seen as a freestanding, almost country house. One of the big trends that happened around 1850 when this was built was there was really some of the first publications on architecture by Andrew Jackson Davis and Andrew Jackson Downing, who were publishing these books on kind of ideal country houses, and a lot of them used this kind of Gothic style as a starting off point. So this is really almost like a Gothic villa. It's a little more freestanding. You can see this house is pulled back from the lot line somewhat, and it also is set back from the street. This shows you this was a very kind of high-end, luxury house as opposed to the other townhouses, which were more making do with a very small site. So here we have some very fancy lintels, a hooded lintel again, but here there's been an insertion of a trefoil sort of detail carved out of brownstone. So this is fairly elaborate, communicating the status of the people who built the house. You can also see the contrafoil detail of the stoop. And then in addition, you have the pointed arches on the metal fence and the pointed arches on the porch. So it's a lot of different pieces of the building are communicating the Gothicness of it. When you're building in New York and you can't build towers and moats and everything. So it's really an applied ornament towards a fairly straightforward building. So behind me is something you don't see very often in Brooklyn, and that's porches. And these Greek Revival houses are really interesting in the fact that they have a uniform street front. This was designed as if it would be one continuous street with a marching colonnade. These weren't really monumental houses. These were a little bit more working class than what you see a little bit further north in Brooklyn Heights. So instead of these being done in stone as if it was a Greek temple, it's taking that language and translating it into things that a carpenter could make. You can also see that there are no stoops here. These are another fairly experimental way of trying to deal with the fact that there's no alley. There's a bit of an areaway, which is different from what you see typically. We're really close to the Atlantic Avenue ferry stop, so these would have been one of the first groupings of houses built when that connection was made. So behind me is a really interesting example of how these houses would evolve over time and be made into something totally new and different from their original selves. All of these houses have had a mansard roof put on, and this was in a much later style of a French Second Empire, about the 1870s. So a mansard roof was something that developed in France in the middle of the 18th century and really was a way of creating an attic within the footprint of a floor. So rather than having a low sloped roof, you end up having a very almost vertical piece of roof that has shingles put on it and then a much lower pitched roof on top of it. It might not be apparent at first, but this house behind me is actually one of the newer houses in Brooklyn Heights, probably dating from around 1905 to 1910. And the first place to look is the lintels. They look a lot like some of the brownstone lintels that we've seen on other houses, but they appear to be made out of cast concrete. There's a very kind of refined detail to it. The brickwork is also taking the forms of a Flemish bond, which is the short, long sort of pattern, but you can see it's picked out in different colors. They're consciously trying to show off the revival of a revival. So this is a fairly early example of the Italianate style, at least starting to emerge in these houses, even though the house is mostly Greek Revival. On top of the windows have these consoles or corbels that are scroll work. They're really sculptural and projecting out from the house. This was a thing that you'll see become a very huge theme in the later Italianate style houses. At this point, glass technology had gotten to the point where you could do these huge sheets of glass, which partially was, these houses started getting much bigger and deeper. So you needed the light to penetrate as deep into the house as possible. So the windows started getting very tall. You also see the stoop railing, very heavily expressed in brownstone, really kind of taking the heft of the material and doing something very sculptural and sinuous with it. Behind me is an example of 3 Italianate style townhouses. Some of the most important things about the Italianate style, aside from the fact that they're built out of the brownstone, is the use of carving. And you can see on top of the doors are these corbels, which are these S-shaped carvings. There's also a huge amount of interest in using arches in these buildings. The Italianate style really came from looking towards Florence and things that happened in the Renaissance. So they were looking towards, again, other than Greece and Rome. As Brooklyn grew, Brooklyn Heights became kind of the center of more kind of upper class living. People wanted to entertain. They wanted to have double parlors. As floor heights got taller, the houses actually also had to get further from the street because the amount of steps to get up to a higher parlor floor means you need to climb more steps, meaning the house needs to push further and further back. So you get these bigger sorts of areaways in front of the house. So behind me are 2 Beaux-Arts style houses. These are something that you don't see a whole lot of in Brooklyn Heights. They happened a little bit later than when this neighborhood was built. They're much lighter and they're a little bit more classical than the other styles we've looked at, which have been more about finding a truly American style. They became popular around the 1890s after the World's Columbian Exposition, which is a very influential World's Fair in Chicago. So you can see the laurel wreaths and Greek crossed in some of the language. You see the use of arches and really kind of express Roman language. We're moving away from brownstone here and finding brick again, and it's using a light brick, almost a Roman sort of brick, a very low horizontal profile. The edges of the building are being expressed with coins. Those are the limestone pieces at the edge of the building that sawtooth in and out, so it's a brick building framed by limestone. So behind me is an example of a Richardsonian Romanesque style house. This is a style that emerged in the late 1870s, 1880s. It was popularized by an architect based in Boston named H.H. Richardson, hence the name. It was really an attempt at finding a purely American style, usually sandstone or brownstone. So these very kind of soft and carvable stones, and they would typically rusticate them. Rustication is usually when you carve away the corner to show the profile of every stone, or something split face like this one where they take a chisel and they make make it almost look like a raw rock. So it's really expressing the kind of the heaviness of the stone. And these sorts of heavy details are almost always paired with a more delicate sort of carving, flowers and leaves that are inspired by nature. Some of the other notably Romanesque details on this are around the porch. You see these grouped columns. So it's taking a very heavy form and making it delicate by expressing it as a grouping of 9 versus 1 element. You also see the twisted columns in some of those inset panels. The cornice has a Romanesque detail where the stone is almost expressed as if it's lattice. That square carving, it almost looks like it could be made of basket work. So they're really playing around with and subverting the true nature of the material while also expressing it in other places. Typically the interiors in these houses were a little bit dark. They used a lot of wood, so they were about mood and mystery. And so the use of stained glass would bring that in. You get this colored light washing into this dark room. It's almost like a jewel box, as opposed to some of the Greek Revival or earlier styles that were more about lightness and air. These were more about coziness and surrounding you. It was obviously begun as a single family house. At one point it was a brothel, and it later expanded into what it is now, which is an apartment house. So, these houses, these big houses, have had multiple lives, and it kind of speaks for the this neighborhood in this part of the city, that it's constantly reinventing and the buildings are becoming new and different versions of themselves.